Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." This comes at the end of chapter 9 of the book of Matthew. You might remember that the way that it's set up is 1 through 4, we get a birth narrative. It's really, I guess, more than birth. It's really just kind of origin, the origin of Christ's earthly ministries. And then from that, it leads into a sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. 5 through 7 is the sermon. You could call it a discourse. So, mountain discourse. And then, if you were to look, what comes next is some healings, 8 through 9, which are also narrative, healing narratives. And then if you were to look at what comes next, in chapter 10, Jesus commissions the disciples, and we go back to discourse. But it's a discourse on missions, a discourse on being sent out. Because Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 through 38, come in between these healing narratives and the discourse on missions, we're seeing basically the end of one and the beginning of the next. This is a transitionary text. A transitionary text. And so it begins like this. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness, right? So we have all the towns and villages, that's 1. Teaching in their synagogues, that's 2. Proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and 4. Healing every disease and sickness. He is going, he is teaching, he is proclaiming, and he is healing these people. These verses, they mirror chapter 4 in the origin narrative, and they serve to basically what he says is the same thing about Jesus' earthly ministry, that he went through all the towns and villages, preaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, healing diseases and sickness. And so they're kind of almost like these bookends from 4 to 9, but not quite. The purpose of them is not so much to bookend a narrative as it is to just explain Jesus' earthly ministry. And what's different about the one here in 35 through 38 in chapter 9 is really here in verse 36. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. If we look at these last couple chapters, 8 through 9, we see Jesus just taking care of all sorts of people, doing all sorts of miracles, and teaching large crowds. And when we're like wondering, how does Jesus feel when he saw the crowds? We could put a then. He had compassion on them, right? Because there's a reason for the Lord's compassion, which is a wonderful thing, right? They were harassed and helpless. So this is the cause of the compassion. If you are wondering, why is the compassion there? It's because they are harassed and helpless. And that should definitely cause us to wonder, why are these crowds harassed and helpless? And then he adds to that, he adds to our understanding with this next phrase, like sheep without a shepherd. So harassed and helpless, this word like, here I'll move my parentheses. Like is the word that connects these two ideas. Harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. So when we think about just that statement, we know that Jesus is the shepherd, right? So this is kind of Jesus being pictured here. The sheep are the crowds, right? And so the question is, where is their shepherds? Who are their shepherds supposed to be, right? And even in the church, Jesus commissions the pastors to be his under shepherds. And so when he says here that they are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, he's really seeing that the Pharisees are not leading the people. They are harassing these helpless sheep. They are getting taught to be perfect, or else God won't accept them, while the Pharisees themselves are sinners and not perfect. And we're going to see, if you read through the book of Matthew, you're going to see that escalate throughout the process of his earthly ministry. So when Jesus sees the crowds, because they are like sheep without a shepherd, he has compassion on them, compassion on these crowds, right? So let's kind of break this up. We got this kind of summary statement. In this next portion, we see Jesus's compassion, right? And that means he understands what they're going through. He has compassion for their experience. When he sees them being bad or sinful, he has compassion on them because he understands that they're not being led properly by the leaders that God has put in place. And so then Jesus says to his disciples, and he starts off this new kind of picture. That's the word I'm looking for. So if we were to look at this first one, we have sheep without a shepherd. That's the picture in this first example. And then in the second example, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. So Jesus' compassion kind of is pictured in shepherds. And then over here, prayer is for the harvest. Let's look into it. Then Jesus says to his disciples, right? So this is kind of Jesus remarking as a summary, as a response to this, right? That's what this is. And so when did Jesus say this? It's unclear, but it must have been after some point of reflection. It must have stuck with Matthew. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So it's like there's all these crops in the fields that need to be harvested, but there's no one to go and do the work. And naturally, our mindset would be like, so go, right? But that's not what Jesus says, right? There's a therefore right here. Now, the therefore isn't where we'd like it right at the end of that sentence, but that's okay. It's still there in terms of, it doesn't change the meaning of this. Ask the Lord of the harvest, right? So the harvest is plentiful, so go? No, that's not what he tells us. So ask. That is the command in this text. Ask the Lord, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Harvest is plentiful, workers are few. So ask the Lord of the harvest. He's the one who cares and is sovereign over the harvest. Ask him to send out, to commission workers into his harvest field. The way to overcome the few worker problem is to ask God to send out more workers into the harvest field. It's such an interesting way of dealing with this because we would be so quick to do things ourselves, and yet he says pray, and we see that in Jesus, right? Though Jesus is God, he prays often, right? He prays for salvation. He prays for those who are going to believe. He prays for those who do believe. He prays for his disciples. And if Jesus prays, how much more then, of course, should we be praying? So ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest field. It should be said that this leads into chapter 10, right, where Jesus commissions, he sends out his disciples, which means that it's both. This part is here, right? Oops, sorry about that. we are going to send out workers into the harvest field. Or sorry, we are going to pray that workers get sent into the harvest field, but we're also recognizing that we shouldn't pray that without also ourselves being willing to go and work in the harvest field. If we would see the need and do nothing about it, our prayers really mean quite little at that point. And so it's a both and, but the first one is to ask Jesus, ask God to send workers out to his harvest field. And a massively important text as we think about missions and how to go about doing them well, how to participate in them well. It's not that we only go, it's not that we only send. It is incredibly important in all of this that we pray, that we ask the Lord.